It's a great pleasure to have the chance to share and think with you, and a delight, as always, to be back with INTA friends and colleagues. The only thing I'm certain of, Mr. Chairman, is that I can't answer those questions. I've come with questions of my own about which I have opinions, but I would like to stretch the points that have been made earlier a little further and to present some additional challenges that I think those original comments bring us. I think one of the big questions for us is who pays? Who pays for this urban development in a time of austerity, in a time when the public sector is reducing its expenditure? So who pays, firstly? And then a second question that again is implicit in the initial comments is, in a context where everybody is trying to avoid risk, how do we manage that risk and share it in a way that allows us to make some bold steps forward? Because it's not too crude, I think, for us to say to ourselves that all the urban development ambitions in the world, we may have them, but unless we can find some way of financing some of these developments, then our prospects remain quite slim and slender. So with those original thoughts, let's try and have a look at what's been going on in the private sector aspect of urban development, where real estate companies, real estate investors, real estate developers have been busy whilst we have been discussing urban development strategy. What's clear to me is that there's been a massive, almost a counterintuitive increase in investment traffic, in the rate of investment, in investment activity across Europe during the last quarter. Real estate investors, property development investors have been deploying some of the money that they've held back this past period. And okay, measuring this year's first recent quarter against the previous year would be to measure ourselves against a low base, but you can see the UK trade volume for this quarter up 12% on the same period year on year last year. Germany, huge increase. France, increase. Central Europe, increase. And interestingly, what some people call the peripherals, down. And in the real estate circles that I'm hearing from, there's a great discussion about the flight to the core, the shift of money to those big, relatively stable, relatively secure cities where investors feel reasonably confident that they can make secure returns, and reduced appetite, at least for the moment, for some of the second cities. In the UK, this means basically everywhere except London is suffering, put crudely. In some other countries, it feels to have a slightly different shape. Germany was always more devolved, and so there may be 4 or 5 principal cities that are the beneficiaries of this. But actually, what's going on is that the private sector is, in some senses, back in the marketplace, but it's not back in the marketplace everywhere to the same degree. There is a much sharper sense of choice being made, and that choice is to the advantage of some and to the disadvantage of others. So let's look at what that might mean. Let's look at those cities that have been hoovering up the private sector investment. Well, London has had some gain. Hamburg is doing pretty well. Interestingly, some of the second cities are featuring, but not so many of them. Question is, how do we create the kind of public-private partnerships that make it possible for cities with ambitions, but especially second cities, second-tier cities with ambition, to attract the kind of private investment that they will need to realize their urban development ambitions at the time when those cities have a reduced ability to deploy their own money, or they're getting reduced subventions from national governments in order to finance some of their urban development ambitions. Okay, well, those of you with wonderful eyesight will be able to see that these blue blobs, the large ones, represent basically retail, and the orange ones residential. What this map tells you when you download it from the INTA website after the event is which specific cities and in which specific sectors private sector investment has been gravitating towards during this last quarter. And saving your eyesight, let me just tell you that there is an increasingly small list of European cities that are attracting large-scale private investment. So, you know, this is the current trend. This may not be the trend forever, probably won't be. However, what it starts to invite is a question about how cities can position themselves to attract private sector investment when their own ability to finance urban development projects is reduced, even for fundamental things like housing development and transport infrastructure development, all of which we know to be absolutely essential. Then turning to the other big theme that I think shapes the issue of who pays and how we manage risk. Everybody's talking about debt and sovereign debt. I would invite you to, if you only remember one thing that I say in this few minutes, I'd invite you to just remember that cities and municipalities also carry huge amounts of debt, and I would wager, I would bet, that by the end of this year and into next year, and by the time we regather at INTA's next Congress, we'll be talking about city and municipal debt. Cities that are going bankrupt, insolvent, semi-insolvent. As ever, the United States seems to give us a foreshadowing of what this might look like. There are whole states, cities, municipalities that are technically insolvent right now, not least the state of California. Some of you will know that even the relatively prosperous town of Orange County went broke, technically, a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. And there are a whole series of municipalities who are currently struggling to repay their bond requirements. They have borrowed in the marketplaces. They are struggling either to repay or get refinancing for those bonds, and the cost of their borrowing has shot up too. That's in the US. Here in Europe, you'll see these are the breakdowns of public sector debt, not all of which is national, much of which exists at the regional, municipality or commune level. And in some countries, it's a significant problem. And as I was preparing these notes that I might share with you, well, goodness me, what happened? Dexia, one of the biggest lenders to cities and municipalities, got into yet another wave of profound difficulty. So let's have a think about the growth of municipal debt, city-level debt in this last period. And I would say to you that what's interesting is those years since 2007, when the levels of outstanding local debt, public debt at local level, has shot up. And again, this is a nice trend when you look at it Europe-wide, but when you start looking at the level of particular cities, it gets even more interesting. So, Chairman, I'll speed up and close because I know there's a timetable and there are other speakers. But let's look at what the credit rating agencies are saying about cities. And again, there'll be a debate about how much we should rely on the advice of credit agencies. Their records are not without blemish, and nobody's going to say that they are imperfect, but I'd argue that they're likely to be even more vigilant now, having failed to spot some of the problems that were pretty profound a couple of years ago. They are rating these sorts of cities as AAA rating, pretty stable, but we know that even countries that had a AAA rating and companies that had a AAA rating recently have lost this. Glad to see that there's an interesting interesting range of cities that are in good standing. I see Marek Bricks there, who very kindly took me to Warsaw earlier in the year. Various cities doing reasonably well, fighting their corner. But then when you start to look at the cities that are struggling, whose credit ratings are regarded as having much more risk, then unsurprisingly you'll see the likes of Athens. My worry is that this list of cities who have borrowed, issued bonds, and are struggling to repay these bonds, that this list will go up. So in a sense, the point of the conversation really is, if...
Excuse me, Jude,
I will conclude.
Thank you.
So the point of the conversation is, in a world where we all have urban development ambitions, where our populations need to be helped to find the next wave of prosperity, who will pay for urban development in a context where the private sector is being progressively more selective about where it will choose to deploy its money? And who will pay for urban development in a context where cities are starting to feel the consequences of their previous ability to repay debt, and where some cities are perceived as comparatively stable and safe for investment, and others are seen as risky and places to avoid in terms of further debt exposure. So the challenges, I would argue, Mr. Chairman, have gone up, and the test for all of us is how we can join together, be it across territories or between the public and private sector, to reduce risk, to invite investment in order to create not only prosperity, but to widen the range of people that can benefit from that prosperity. Thank you very much.